Once, in a time when stars were thought to be the lanterns of shepherds guarding the sky, there lay nestled between green hills and whispering trees a hidden village named Bramblehollow. It was a quiet place, wrapped in soft fog and secrets. Moss blanketed the old stones like a grandmother's quilt, and the air was always sweet with the scent of wild mint, chimney smoke, and apple bread cooling on windowsills. Bramblehollow was not marked on any map. The world outside had long since forgotten it, which suited the villagers well. Their lives were measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of the river and the songs of birds. Time in Bramblehollow walked barefoot, at its own gentle pace. In the heart of the village, where a willow tree bent low enough to whisper to the cobblestones, lived a girl named Linwin. She was 12 years old, though no one truly kept count. Her hair was the color of honey dipped in shadow, and her eyes held the stillness of deep water. She lived in a round cottage with her grandfather, Alder, a quiet man whose laughter could still shake the rafters on good days. Alder had once been a lantern keeper, not just of the village, but of the old way. His job, long ago, had been to carry the Emberlight, a small, ancient flame said to be given by the moon itself. This ember burned inside a lantern unlike any other, its light soft and gold as candle honey, but strong enough to keep sorrow and shadow away. Each evening, just as the sun slid behind the hills, Alder would hobble out to the crooked iron post near their cottage and light the lantern of Bramblehollow. No storm could snuff its glow, no frost dim it. The villagers didn't question its magic. They only knew that as long as the lantern burned, their dreams would stay warm and safe. Linwin, wrapped in her wool cloak, would sit on the step each night, watching the lantern flicker against the dusk. She often wondered about the ember inside. It never seemed to fade or wane, and though her grandfather said little about it, she had seen him whisper to it once, the way one might whisper to an old friend. One autumn night, when the air smelled of dry leaves and cinnamon bark, Alder placed a strange bundle on the hearth and looked at Linwin with eyes both tired and bright. "It's nearly your turn, my girl," he said softly. "My turn for what?" she asked, brushing flour from her apron. "To carry the light." Linwin blinked. "The Emberlight?" Alder nodded, settling slowly into his old armchair, the one that groaned with age each time he sat in it. He gestured for her to come closer, and she padded over, her bare feet silent against the rug. "There's more to this flame than you've been told," he said, his voice like creaking timbers in a warm wind. "It isn't just fire. It's memory and comfort, and the old magic that once blanketed the world before people began trading wonder for reason." Linwin tilted her head, wide-eyed. "But why me?" Alder smiled, and it made the wrinkles around his eyes fold like the pages of an old book. "Because you still look up at the stars as if you've never seen them before. That's the first sign of a true keeper." He unwrapped the bundle on the hearth. Inside was a map, drawn in soft strokes of ochre and faded ink, the kind of map that didn't tell you where to go, but hinted where magic might still be found. There was also a small, smooth stone shaped like a droplet, etched with runes only visible when held to firelight. "This stone will help you see what most have forgotten to look for," Alder said. "It was given to me when I was no older than you. I carried it across the wending moors and through the hollowwood, where trees still speak to those who listen." Linwin's heart fluttered like a moth near flame. She reached for the stone and felt a pleasant warmth bloom in her fingers, like the memory of a story half remembered. "But where would I go?" she asked, voice soft. "Wherever the light dims," Alder replied. "You'll know. The ember will show you." He leaned forward, his hands covering hers. "There are places, child, even now, where sorrow creeps in through cracks in the world. Places where laughter has grown quiet and dreams turn gray. Your lantern's glow will remind them. Sometimes that's all it takes." The next morning, Linwin awoke before the sun. Fog lay over Bramblehollow like a thick woolen blanket, muffling every sound. The lantern still burned outside, casting a golden haze through the mist. She dressed quietly, wrapping her traveling cloak around her shoulders and tucking the runestone into her pocket. Alder was already in the kitchen, placing a small loaf of nut bread and a flask of rosehip tea into a satchel. "I knew you'd go," he said with a smile, not looking up. "I feel like I have to," she whispered. "You do," he agreed. As she stepped onto the path that led out of the village, the lantern in her hand glowed not with fire, but with a pulsing warmth that reminded her of lullabies and the way her grandfather's stories always ended with hope. She turned once to see Alder wave, then disappeared into the mists, the light of the ember guiding her through the trees. Thus began Linwin's journey, not a quest of swords and dragons, but one of quiet magic, gentle courage, and the kind of strength that lives in small kindnesses. She followed paths most would miss. The narrow trail hidden behind the weeping birches, the stone bridge that only appeared when the moon was full, the gap in the hedge that whispered her name on windy nights. Her first stop was the village of Fern Row, where the leaves always fell too early and never turned gold. The children there no longer played in the fields, and laughter seemed to echo from long ago. Linwin arrived as twilight kissed the sky, and hung her lantern on the old iron gate at the village's edge. The next morning, the leaves had turned amber. By afternoon, the children were skipping stones in the brook. No one saw Linwin leave, but they spoke of her for years after. The girl with the glowing lantern who brought autumn back to Fern Row. From Fern Row, Linwin followed the path where wild thyme and heather grew between the stones. The lantern swung gently in her hand, and with each step it glowed a little brighter, as though it knew where it was going even when she did not. The next village was Bristlewick, tucked between two wooded hills and surrounded by fields that once grew sweet barley and sun-yellow squash. But the fields had turned gray, and the scarecrows in them stood listlessly, slumped like forgotten guardians. No birds sang in Bristlewick. The wind carried no song. Linwin arrived just as dusk painted the sky in purples and smudged gold. An old man, wrinkled as a baked apple and draped in a patched cloak, watched her from a crumbling fence post. He did not speak, but his eyes followed the light of the lantern like someone remembering the scent of spring after a long winter. She walked through the center of the village, where even the fountain no longer bubbled. The stones beneath her feet felt heavy, tired. She paused at the old well, its bucket long gone, its rope frayed to threads, and hung her lantern from the iron hook above its mouth. Then she sat down beside it and waited. That night, the villagers dreamt of sunlight. Children stirred in sleep, giggling softly, and in one small house, an old woman who hadn't spoken in years whispered the name of her childhood dog. By morning, the barley fields shimmered with green gold shoots. A robin landed atop the scarecrow's hat and chirped a song that made a baby laugh. Linwin took up her lantern and continued on. Days passed, then weeks, and the road wove like a lullaby through misty valleys, sleepy forests, and hills where sheep watched her with curious, peaceful eyes. Each place she stopped was more faded than the last, villages where colors had dulled, markets grown silent, and people spoke in short, hollow tones. And yet, wherever the lantern glowed, life returned. She reached a coastal town called Hollow on the 23rd night of her journey. There, the sea had grown restless. Waves crashed with strange fury, and fishing boats remained anchored, their sails stiff with salt and disuse. The sky above the sea remained overcast for months at a time, and some claimed they no longer remembered what the stars looked like. Linwin found an old lighthouse crumbling at the edge of the cliffs. Its top had long caved in, and gulls made nests where the beacon once shone. She climbed its winding stairs, each one groaning beneath her small feet, and when she reached the top, she placed the lantern where the great flame had once burned. That night, for the first time in 3 years, the sky above Hollow cleared. The stars blinked shyly into view, and the sea fell quiet, lapping gently at the shore as if soothed by a lullaby only it could hear. The townsfolk lit their lanterns again. Fishermen sang to the tide. Children pointed up at constellations, trying to remember the old names. Linwin stayed for 3 days, helping mend nets and gathering driftwood for a bonfire. When she left, they gave her a scarf woven from sea thread and dyed with kelp and moonberry. A quiet thank you from those who could not find the words. Not all the places Linwin visited welcomed her. In the dark woods near Hollowmere, she encountered creatures of sorrow, mist wolves and weeping crows, shadows that slithered between branches and sighed when no one listened. They had lived there long before people came, feeding on forgotten songs and memories buried beneath frost. When Linwin's lantern entered that part of the forest, the shadows hissed and tried to snuff it out with wind and dread. They whispered things into her ears, doubts and fears and names she didn't know but somehow felt she should remember. She held the lantern high. The light flared like warm thunder, not loud, but full and whole and ancient, and the shadows withdrew, cowering beneath roots and into hollows too deep for any warmth to reach. At the heart of the forest, Linwin found a single sycamore tree with bark pale as moonlight. Beneath it was a small cradle, covered in moss, where something once lived. She knelt and placed the lantern beside it. The forest sighed. Somewhere above, a lark began to sing. She continued for months. She slept beneath the stars when she could. In barns, in empty shrines, once in a hollowed tree that cradled her like a mother. She met people who had nearly given up hope, shepherds whose flocks no longer bleated, healers whose herbs had lost their scent, and bakers whose bread no longer rose. She left behind light and warmth and laughter. But the ember was never hers to keep. She knew it now. It belonged to the world. It was a reminder, a memory of the magic that still lingered in quiet places and kind acts. One night, on a hill with no name, Linwin finally stopped walking. The lantern flickered. She knew what it meant. A figure approached, cloaked in sky-blue wool, leaning on a staff carved with stars. They said nothing, only knelt beside her and opened their hands. Linwin, without a word, passed them the lantern. The flame flickered once, then burned steady. "It's your turn now," she whispered. The figure nodded, and Linwin laid back against the grass, the stars glimmering above like silver blossoms. She smiled. Somewhere, far below, another village was waiting. The figure who took the lantern was not as young as Linwin had been, but neither were they old. They were somewhere in between, with hands that knew the feel of earth and sky, and eyes that had watched both sorrow and wonder and learned not to turn away from either. Their name was Corwin. Corwin came from a place that no longer had a name. It had been swallowed by ivy and time, and when people spoke of it now, they did so in the way one speaks of a half-remembered song. Gently, uncertainly, with more feeling than fact. He had not meant to become the next lantern-bearer. He had only followed a dream, one where a girl with honey-shadowed hair smiled at him beside a willow tree and said, "It's time." When he woke, there were footprints of light leading from his doorstep into the woods. He followed them until the trees thinned and the stars blinked down like old friends. At the top of the hill, she was waiting, her lantern glowing softly in the hush. Now the lantern was his to carry. Corwin walked west, toward the mountains, where rumors had long spoken of villages carved into stone and voices that echoed even after their speakers were gone. The Emberlight pulsed softly in his hand, as if remembering Linwin still, as if adjusting to this new bearer with cautious hope. In the foothills of the ardent peaks lay a stone town called Grimbarrow. Its buildings were carved from granite and laced with old sigils no one could read anymore. The people there were silent, not because they were unkind, but because they had learned to live with echoes that spoke back. It was said that the mountains remembered. Corwin arrived on a silver-misted morning. Fog curled like cats between the cobbles, and the sun wore a veil of gray. Children peered from shuttered windows, their cheeks pale. The market square held no stalls, only empty crates and baskets that hadn't seen fruit or laughter in years. He made no grand announcement. Instead, he found an old stone niche at the edge of the square, once a place for candles and prayers, and set the lantern within it. He waited, 1 hour, then 2. The light warmed slowly. It seeped into the stones, into the walls, into the bones of the mountain itself. That night, Grimbarrow slept deeply and peacefully for the first time in a decade. And when dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, the echoes did not stir. The mountain, it seemed, had stopped remembering pain. Corwin stayed in Grimbarrow for several days. The villagers, though still quiet, welcomed him with shy nods and offered gifts. honey preserved in stone jars, tiny woven cloaks for the lantern, songs written in the mountain tongue. He accepted all with gentle gratitude and moved on. As he journeyed, he encountered places the lantern refused to shine. A fallen temple in the withered hollows, a field where no grass had grown since the great dimming, a crossroads where travelers were said to vanish if they chose the northern path. In those places, the Emberlight dimmed, curling inward like a frightened animal. Corwin would not press it. He would sit instead, sometimes a day, sometimes 3, and hum old lullabies beside the dim flame until, slowly, it began to brighten again. He did not force light where it was not welcome. He only offered it, and that, it turned out, was enough. One evening, in the village of Moss Willow, known for its lavender tea and bookbinders, an old woman named Nara told Corwin a story as they sat by her hearth. "Long ago," she said, "before the lanterns were carried by hands, they were carried by birds, great firefinches whose feathers glowed like ember silk. They flew from village to village, bringing light and dreams in their wake. But then came the gray season, and the birds vanished. It was people who picked up the lanterns after that. Not to replace the birds, mind you, just to keep the dreams alive." Corwin smiled. "I never heard that one. You're still young," Nara said, though she was not sure if she meant in years or something else. "Give it time." She gave him a feather the next morning, copper red and soft as breath. "Found it by my window the night you arrived," she said. "Might be the world saying thank you." The path of the lantern bearer was never straight. Corwin found himself in places that defied maps. Cliffside towns accessible only by rope bridges. Forests that rearranged their trails after midnight. A village where no one spoke, but everyone dreamed the same dream. And always the lantern glowed. Some nights fierce and proud, others low and flickering, but never gone. Once he came to a place called Delmere by night. No one there had slept in years. The townsfolk moved like ghosts, with eyes rimmed in gray and voices thin as cobwebs. They had forgotten birthdays, songs, even their own names. Corwin lit the lantern in the center of their square, and for 7 nights he sat with them. He listened to their silence. He held their hands. He said their names back to them when they remembered. On the 8th night they slept, and in their dreams the stars returned. After Delmere by night, Corwin walked eastward, along old river trails where willows wept without knowing why and herons flew like slow thoughts across the sky. The emberlight in his lantern had changed again. Deeper now, more golden than before, like honey steeped in memory. It was said the waking forest stood at the edge of the world. No road led there, only whispers. Stories passed between peddlers and letter carriers, through markets and taverns. Some claimed the trees there could speak. Others said the forest was always dreaming, and should it ever fully wake, it would forget what kindness meant. Corwin did not intend to enter it. He meant only to pass its edges on his way to the southern coast. But the lantern, ever more alive than it seemed, warmed in his hand and leaned toward the woods. Not physically, of course, but in the quiet way a dog might point its ears at a distant sound. So Corwin followed the pull. The edge of the waking forest was not marked by a gate or hedge, but by stillness. The air changed, time folded, leaves held their breath. Even the birdsong hushed into reverent silence. The trees were taller here than any he had known, their trunks twisted like question marks, their bark as dark as starlit iron, vines as thin as hair curled down like listening threads. The path, if it was a path, coiled between the roots and shadows. The lantern cast a soft glow ahead of him, never strong, but just enough to see where not to step. For 3 days he walked without seeing another soul. On the 4th he found a clearing. There, sitting cross-legged on a mossy stone, was a child, or what seemed to be a child. For their hair was the color of moonlight and their skin shimmered faintly, like a reflection on water. They looked up at Corwin with eyes that were not entirely young. "You're late," the child said, though not unkindly. "Late for what?" Corwin asked. "For listening." The child stood, brushed leaf dust from their knees, and walked to a ring of stones at the center of the clearing. There, Nestled in the moss was another lantern. It looked older than the one Corwin carried, its glass dimmed by age, its metal frame green with time. "This one forgot how to shine," the child said, kneeling beside it. "The forest gave it dreams, but it never learned to wake." "May I try?" Corwin asked. The child nodded. Corwin crouched beside the sleeping lantern and opened its door. Inside, there was no ember, only the hollow curve of where one once lived. He held up his own lantern, its golden light flickering with interest. Then, as if understanding something ancient and wordless, the emberlight flared just slightly, and a small, steady thread of light passed from Corwin's lantern into the other. The moment it happened, the trees around the clearing exhaled. A soft breeze stirred the branches. The moss blushed green again. The old lantern blinked awake. "Thank you," said the child. "The forest remembers now." Corwin looked around. "What will it do with that memory?" "Rest," the child said. "And wait. Some places don't need answers, only to be remembered." Corwin continued on. He crossed mountain bridges strung with lanterns made from thistleglass and sapphire beetle shell. He helped a widow in Brightmere remember her husband's name by lighting the emberlight in the room where they first danced. He watched snow fall in silence with a blind monk who heard poems in the crackle of frost. Everywhere he went, the lantern listened, learned, shared, and Corwin, in turn, grew quieter. Not sad, not weary, just full, as if the world was pouring its stories into him, and he was learning to carry them gently. The coast was quieter than Corwin had imagined. He'd expected gulls and salt spray, ships creaking in harbor, shouting sailors, the clang of ropes and sails, but Greywind Harbor had not heard such sounds in years. It was not abandoned, not entirely, but time had slipped its fingers into the town's seams. The seawall was cracked, ivy crowned the bell tower, and salt fog curled around buildings like a half-forgotten lullaby. Wind chimes hung from every porch, but they hadn't rung in a generation. The lantern knew the way. It led Corwin down cobbled alleys, past shuttered bakeries and dusty watchposts, until he stood before the chapel at the edge of the bay. Its doors hung crooked on rusted hinges, its windows clouded with sea grime. Above the chapel, a great bell hung silent, the Bell of Turin, they once called it, forged by monks who claimed to trap a storm's heart inside its bronze. According to the stories, the bell had rung only once, the day the waves refused to rise. Corwin stepped inside. Inside the chapel, time had pooled. Dust lay like snowfall over the pews, and cobwebs traced lace in every corner. But the altar was clean. Someone or something still remembered. He placed the lantern upon it. The golden light flared, illuminating carved reliefs worn smooth with age. A mural shimmered faintly on the back wall. Not paint, but glass mosaic, showing a line of people bearing lanterns across the sea. Beneath it, inscribed in runes even Corwin could read, "When all else forgets, light remembers." At that moment, something above stirred. A low groan echoed through the rafters. A slow tremble. Then, impossibly, a chime. The bell of Turin rang. Once, long and low, like a whale's song deep beneath the ocean. It rolled through the harbor, brushing ships that had long since rotted, waking echoes in cliffside caves. And with that sound, the fog receded. Not vanished, just eased. Windows opened, doors creaked. Somewhere a child's laugh, the scent of baking. The chimes began to stir in the wind. Corwin stepped outside as lanterns flickered to life all through Greywind Harbor. Not his doing, not entirely. It was the memory his lantern had awoken, and the town's heart, still beating somewhere deep. Corwin's journey took him inland again, over meadows that hummed with bees, through a grove where foxes slept beside deer, and across a causeway of ancient teeth, white, weather-worn stones that rose from a flooded plain. He followed the lantern to a hill few remembered, though it once marked the center of the realm. Upon it stood a stone arch, cracked and quiet. Beneath it, nothing but wind and grass. But this place was not empty. It dreamed. The dreaming stone, it was called in elder tongues. A hinge of the world, where those who truly listened might hear songs too old to be sung aloud. It was said that when stars first took shape, this hill listened and remembered. Corwin sat before it for 3 nights. He said nothing, lit no fire, ate only wind-fallen fruit and drank from the silver spring that ran beneath the hill. On the 4th night, the lantern's flame danced upward. It did not flicker as it usually did. It spiraled, and above the arch, a shimmer opened. A doorway, a memory, a light. From it, shapes emerged. Not creatures, not ghosts, but echoes. They resembled people. Faces kind, hands open, but shimmered like moonlight on a pond. They circled Corwin, not menacing, curious, as if they, too, remembered something but could not speak. The lantern glowed steadily. Corwin did not move. And then one of them, a figure with hair like ashfall and eyes like rain, touched the lantern's rim with one translucent fingertip. "Still it burns," she whispered. "Still it walks." Corwin nodded. "I carry it. That's all." "More than all," she said. And with that, they folded back into the shimmer, and the doorway side shut. In the grass where they stood, small blossoms bloomed. Forget-me-nots, pale as frost. Years passed, or perhaps only seasons. But when Corwin's boots finally touched the edge of Bramblehollow again, he was not the same boy who had once listened to Alder stories by firelight. The village was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he was simply larger, fuller, filled with stories, with quiet light, with the memory of places most maps had lost. Alder was gone. He had passed in the spring, just after the swallows returned. But the chair by the hearth still held a dent, and his pipe still hung above the mantel. The lantern hook outside the cottage swayed gently, as if waiting. Corwin hung his lantern there. The emberlight flickered once, then flared golden. And in that moment, every lantern in the village, old and cold, sparked to life. One by one, a chain of memory, a ring of stories unforgotten. That night, Bramblehollow glowed brighter than it ever had. Children danced under the eaves. Elders sang old songs. And a boy sat on the porch steps, wide-eyed, as Corwin began to tell his tale. Not of battles or beasts, but of the Emberlight, a quiet courage, of places that remember. Spring passed into the slow golden yawn of summer, and the Emberlight still burned above the door of Corwin's cottage. By then, people in the surrounding hamlets had heard whispers, not rumors of danger, but of wonder, of lanterns lit that had long since gone dark, of winds that smelled of honeysuckle and old magic, of dreams remembered after decades of silence. Some came seeking help, others came seeking hope. Corwin welcomed them all with warm tea, soft bread, and a listening ear. But it was one visitor, a small, wide-eyed girl named Malin, who set his next path in motion. She arrived just after dusk, barefoot, with leaves in her hair and a question on her lips. "Do moths dream?" she asked, sitting quietly by the fire. Corwin, unbothered by the oddness of the question, answered with a smile. "I think they do. Else why would they always chase the light?" She nodded. "My gran says they remember things no one else can. They gather stories in their wings." Malin unfolded a tattered map. It showed a place far north, where the hills bled into the sky, and mist coiled around the ground like silk. Drawn in soft charcoal, there was a broken tower and a crescent symbol carved above it. "The Moth Temple," she whispered. "It's waking up again." Corwin felt the lantern warm at his side. The journey north took 12 days and a 13th that never made the maps. The forest thickened. The trees grew taller, stranger, their bark etched with spirals, their roots forming bridges over old, murmuring streams. As they walked, moths followed them. Dozens at first, then hundreds, not swarming but surrounding as if guiding. They arrived on the eve of the full moon. The Moth Temple was less a building and more a ruin held together by memory. Vines crowned its stone arches, and pale flowers bloomed in the cracks. At the center stood a dais, and on it a prism, not of glass, of crystal the color of a sleeping moon. The moths gathered there, silent, watching. Corwin approached with Malin at his side. He placed the Emberlight atop the dais. The prism shimmered. The moth's wings began to glow, and then, in a whisper softer than falling snow, the stories began. Not in words, but in dreams. Corwin saw a world before roads, when voices could shape the wind. He saw ancient keepers like himself, cradling lights in jars of starstone. He saw the first lantern lit by the last wish of a dying moon. And then the light faded. The moths fluttered, circling the prism, then scattered into the night, carrying stories with them. Corwin and Malin stood silent. "You gave it your dream," she whispered. "No," Corwin said softly. "It gave me mine." Upon returning to Bramblehollow, Corwin found something waiting on his doorstep. A package wrapped in linen, sealed with green wax. Inside was a book, not new, bound in soft leather, worn at the corners. Inside, pages and pages of neat handwriting, diagrams, even pressed flowers. It was Alder's journal, but more than that, it was the keeper's book. Each generation, the keeper passed it on, adding their part of the story. Corwin turned the pages with reverence. There were sketches of the Emberlight's design, notes on how it hummed differently in certain places, records of lost hamlets, of forgotten bridges, of trees that whispered names in the wind. At the very center was a blank page, and beneath it, a small phrase in Alder's hand, "For the next story." So Corwin wrote, not all at once, only at night, after the lantern had been lit and the sky hummed with stillness. He wrote of the dreaming stone, the bell of Turin, the temple of moths, of Malin's question, and the answer it had uncovered. And every so often others would come. They'd sit by the fire. They'd bring tales, small ones, strange ones, lost ones. Corwin wrote those down too. Not all stories are grand. Some are quiet, like a breeze through a kitchen window, or the way tea smells just before it steams. He believed those were the ones worth keeping. It had been many years. Linwin had long since become a keeper herself, watching over lanterns in the eastern groves. Malin traveled with a satchel full of moth songs, teaching children how to listen with their hearts. And Corwin grew older, not weary, but full. One winter's evening, as frost drew lace on the windows and the chimney sighed with warmth, Corwin stood at the old iron post outside his door. The lantern flickered, not from wind, not from want, but from readiness. He took it down, held it to his chest, and smiled. Then, with hands that still remembered every page, every path, every glow and glimmer, he placed the Emberlight gently into the hands of a new keeper. A boy, perhaps no older than Corwin had once been. The boy's eyes held stars. "You'll do fine," Corwin said softly. "Just listen." And with that, the Emberlight flared, and Corwin's story too became light. They say that sometimes, in early spring, when the frost hasn't quite faded from the ground and the wind smells like old books and chimney soot, you might see a line of lanterns in the mist. They do not speak. They do not stop. But if you follow them, if your heart is quiet and your pockets are free of pride, you might reach a place no map remembers. A village where the willow still whispers to the cobblestones, where the air is soft with bread and mint and stories. And there, beneath a crooked lantern post, you may find a book, unfinished, waiting, for your story too is a light. And the moths, they remember, always. There was a place deep in the woods beyond Bramblehollow, past the fogged-over meadows and the creek that whispered lullabies to the mossy stones. Few ever went there, not because it was dangerous, but because it was easy to forget it existed. Paths to it curved in gentle spirals and sometimes led you back home without realizing you'd turned. But Corwin had once seen it on an old map, hand-drawn and curling at the corners, and had marked it with a star that looked more like a sleepy sun. It was called the clockroot tree, not because it kept time like a tower bell or sundial, but because its roots wound in perfect spirals beneath the earth. Some said the tree could remember every season it had ever lived through, and others believed it dreamed of time itself, stretching both backward and forward. One still morning, Linwin returned to Bramblehollow with wind in her cloak and a wooden charm around her neck carved in the shape of an eye. She had journeyed long through the eastern groves and returned not just with tales, but with a calling. "The clockroot tree is waking," she told Corwin over tea, the fire casting golden patterns on their cups. Corwin nodded, unsurprised. The lantern at his side had flickered the same morning, not in warning, but in invitation. They packed slowly, not out of reluctance but care, and set out before the dew had finished yawning off the grass. The journey was quiet. Birds trilled in low tones as if singing lullabies to the sky. Along the way, the lantern pulsed with soft light, never bright enough to blind, always enough to see. It was Linwin who found the clearing first. The ground felt different there. Not wrong, but thick, like the world was remembering too much all at once. And at its center, the clockroot tree stood. It was taller than any tree in the hollow, its bark silvered with age and soft with lichen. From its branches hung strands of what looked like thread spun from moonlight, slow, swaying in no wind. The lantern flickered again, and the ground beneath their feet hummed. Corwin stepped forward, heart still. He touched the bark. Memories unfolded. Not his, but the tree's. He saw the first keeper, barefoot in frost, singing songs in a forgotten tongue. He saw the flame before it had a name. A spark held between two palms, gifted by a creature made of dusk and wind. He saw the first lantern forged in river light and soot. And then he saw what had not yet happened. Linwin, standing beneath a sky painted with twin moons. 1,000 lanterns glowing across mountaintops. The Emberlight in her hand, older now, but unbroken. When the vision faded, the tree offered a gift. From its roots emerged a small seed, shaped like a teardrop and warm to the touch. "A memory seed," Linwin whispered. Corwin nodded. "To be planted when the world is ready to remember again." Years passed. Corwin, now more silver than shadow, turned his cottage into something new. A school. Not of letters and sums, but of lanterns and lore. Children came from all over. Not many, never more than could fit comfortably around a fire. They brought with them dreams and questions, and broken bits of wonder they didn't know how to hold. Corwin taught them how to listen to the light. He showed them how to draw maps that could only be read in starlight, how to whisper to river stones, how to press their palms to trees and feel the heartbeat beneath. They learned to build lanterns, not all with flame, some with stories, others with music, a few with laughter that could only be heard in the hour before dawn. And at the center of it all, in a glass dome nestled among wildflowers, burned the Emberlight, never dimming. One day, a boy named Fen, quiet, always sketching clouds, asked, "Will the light ever go out?" Corwin placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "No, but it might change its name." The seed from the clockroot tree was planted one midsummer night beneath the old willow at the center of the village. No one expected it to grow, and yet, by the time the first frost kissed the grass, a sapling stood where once there had only been moss and stories. Its leaves shimmered with golden veins, and at night, small lights gathered in its branches. Not fireflies, but something softer. They called it the remembering tree. Each lantern lit beneath its boughs glowed a little warmer. Children dreamed more vividly. Old songs were hummed again without knowing why. Even the moths returned, wings aglow, to nest gently in its hollows. Linwin, now keeper of the grove, visited each season. She left behind feathers, riddles, and pressed pages of the keeper's book, which Corwin had passed to her one snowy morning with eyes full of light. Bramblehollow had become more than a village. It had become a lantern, and its glow was felt far beyond the hills. One mist-crowned morning, when even the sun seemed to be walking softly, a knock came at the lantern school's round door. It wasn't loud, nor hurried, just a gentle rhythm, like a lullaby with knuckles. Corwin, older now but still steady, opened the door and found a stranger standing there. She wore a coat the color of wolves and snow, fastened with bone buttons carved in spirals. Her hair was silver, not with age but with frost, and her eyes held a strange hue, like twilight frozen in glass. "I'm looking," she said, "for a lantern that remembers my name." Corwin stepped aside with a smile. "Then you've come to the right place." She introduced herself only as Vera and said little about where she came from, only that it was farther north than birds dared fly, where the stars were so bright they hummed. The Emberlight pulsed when she entered the cottage, not in warning, but in greeting, like an old friend rediscovered after many winters. Vera did not stay long. She shared tea, 3 songs, and 1 story, about a lantern carved into the tusk of a mammoth, hidden beneath the ice. And then she left, leaving behind only a handful of snow that never melted and a charm shaped like a wind bell. Linwin returned that evening, the charm in her hand. "She's one of us," she said quietly. Corwin nodded. "The light always knows its own." One autumn, something strange began to happen in Bramblehollow. The stars above the village began to change. They moved, not fast or wildly, but slowly, forming new patterns, weaving old constellations into unfamiliar shapes. The villagers noticed first in their dreams. Strange skies, mirrored lakes, paths that pointed not north, but inward. Then, one evening, the Emberlight changed color. Just briefly. For one breath, it turned silver blue, the color of remembered things. That night, Linwin dreamed of a stairway carved into the sky. At its top stood a great hollow, cradled in the air like a nest. In its center burned a lantern so old it had no name, only a song. When she awoke, she knew what she had to do. With a small pack and her keeper's lantern, she set off beyond the hills, past where maps curled into clouds. Along the way, she met other lantern-bearers. A girl who sang to rocks until they glowed. A baker who etched stories into loaves of bread. A prince who had traded his crown for a bell that rang in dreams. They joined her, step by step, lantern by lantern. Together they reached the edge of the sky, not in a storm or battle, but in hush. The stars dipped low like bowed heads, and a path unfolded. Petals of starlight, soft and sure. At the top, they found the hollow. Inside, the nameless lantern waited. Its light was warm and cool, heavy and feather-light. It did not burn. It breathed, and it spoke not in words, but in knowing. "You are not the last. You are the beginning." When Linwin returned, the village had changed. Not in shape, but in spirit. Children now walked with glowing ribbons tied to their wrists. Birds sang tunes that echoed in the stone. The willow tree at the center of the village shed leaves that glowed for a moment before fading into the soil like wishes. Lanterns were no longer just objects. They had become people, stories, laughter, sadness, truth, carried in songs, in recipes, in lullabies hummed while braiding hair. The Emberlight remained eternal, yet humble. But now it burned beside many other lights. 1,000 tiny embers, each one held by a keeper. Some lit their way through mountains, others through memory, and some simply burned quietly on windowsills, keeping the night soft. Years passed, then more. One rainy evening, Corwin sat by the hearth, now rarely teaching but always listening. He held the keeper's book, its cover soft with age, its pages full not of spells or rules, but sketches, poems, and names. So many names. At the very end, he found one last blank page. He dipped his pen, paused, and wrote, "The light is not mine and never was. It belongs to every child who sees shapes in clouds, to every wanderer who finds their way home, to every story whispered in the dark to keep fear away, to every hand held in silence, to every flame shared without asking. This is not the end. This is the glow before another dawn." And with that, he closed the book, the lantern flickering beside him like an old friend breathing. Winter in Bramblehollow was always a time of stillness and soft white blankets that muffled the world. But one year, something different stirred beneath the snow. The lanterns began to dim. At first, it was barely noticeable. A flicker here, a sigh of light there. The Emberlight, steady as always, seemed to struggle against a creeping chill. The lanterns in the schoolrooms flickered with uncertainty, and even the remembering trees glowed dulled to a faint shimmer. The villagers gathered around the great willow, their breaths puffing clouds in the crisp air, worry knitting their brows. Corwin, frail but fierce with purpose, spoke in a voice like cracking wood. The light listens to the heart of the world. When it quiets, something is amiss. Linwin, now keeper of the grove, nodded. We must find the source before the darkness grows. The next morning, wrapped in wool and hope, she set out with Fen, the quiet boy who sketched clouds, and a small band of lantern-bearers. The journey took them beyond frozen rivers and fields glazed with ice. Along the way, the lanterns pulsed faintly, guiding them as if the light itself was leading their steps. They reached the hollow beneath the stars once more, but it was not as they remembered. The nameless lantern flickered weakly, its glow like a candle in a rainstorm. Linwin reached out, pressing her palm to its cool surface. The lantern did not speak this time, but images came to her mind. A veil of silence spreading, an ancient lullaby forgotten, a broken promise between the stars and the earth. Fen stepped forward and sketched quickly in the snow. A map formed of shapes and symbols no one else could read but seemed somehow familiar. Together, they realized the light was not just a flame, but a song. And the song had been paused. To rekindle the light, the keepers needed to remember the old melodies. Songs sung not with voices, but with hearts. They gathered in the village square, the lanterns hanging from every branch and rooftop like captured stars. One by one, the villagers shared what they remembered. Lullabies sung by mothers, tales told by firelight, the hum of the wind through the ancient trees. The Emberlight pulsed in rhythm. Linwin and Fen led the chorus, voices gentle and steady, weaving the fragments of forgotten song back into a whole. Slowly, the lanterns began to glow brighter, the remembering tree shimmering with renewed light. The winter chill softened, and the village was filled with warmth, not just from flame, but from the shared song that bound their hearts. News came from across distant waters, a tale carried by traveling traders wrapped in sails and salt. A lantern, much like the Emberlight, had been found on an island carved from coral and cloud. Its light was blue, like deep ocean waves, and it held memories of journeys taken and those yet to come. Linwin knew this lantern must be welcomed into the fold. She prepared a small boat, lantern in hand, and with a few trusted keepers, set sail beneath skies painted in twilight hues. The sea was vast and whispering, but the lanterns glowed steadily against the dark. When they reached the island, they found not just a lantern, but a whole village glowing softly with light born from waves and song. The islanders welcomed them with music that rose like foam on the wind, and stories of stars that danced with the tides. The lantern from Bramblehollow and the ocean lantern joined in a dance of light, a promise that no matter how far, the glow would find its way. Returning home, Linwin carried a new hope. She began to weave plans for a bridge, not of stone or wood, but of dreams and light. The villagers gathered every evening beneath the stars, sending up lanterns with wishes tied like ribbons. The dreams took flight, fragile and bright, and formed a shimmering path stretching beyond the horizon. It was said that if you followed the bridge of dreams, you could find any lost light or forgotten story. The children of Bramblehollow often stood at the edge of the village, eyes wide and hopeful, watching the glowing arc stretch across the night sky. Corwin, watching from his window, whispered, "The light never stops growing." In the quiet of a spring dawn, Corwin sat alone by the hearth, the keeper's book resting on his lap. The village was alive with light and laughter, but he knew his time was near to pass the lantern and its stories to the next keeper. Linwin entered, carrying a basket of wildflowers and a new lantern, crafted from the glass of dawn. She sat beside him, taking the book gently. "Are you ready?" she asked. Corwin smiled, eyes bright with years of flame. "Always. The light belongs to those who carry it forward." As the sun rose, the two keepers sat together, sharing stories in silence, knowing that the glow of Bramblehollow would continue long after their own flames grew faint. Long before Linwin's time, the village was smaller, quieter, and the willow tree that now stood proudly in the center was but a sapling. It was said that the willow was planted by a wandering keeper named Maelise, who carried a lantern unlike any other. a lantern that whispered secrets of the forest. Melis traveled from village to village, lighting fires and telling stories to lonely travelers. One chilly evening, she reached Bramblehollow, weary and worn from the road. Beneath the twilight sky, she planted her lantern beside a tiny willow sapling, whispering a blessing of growth and protection. The lantern's light intertwined with the sapling's roots, and from that night on, the willow began to glow softly each evening, a beacon of hope and shelter for all who sought refuge. Villagers soon discovered that when the wind passed through the willow's branches, it carried voices, not loud, but soothing whispers that reminded them of forgotten dreams and the courage to face tomorrow. The whispering willow became a place where the children gathered before bed, where lovers carved promises into the bark, and where the keepers came to listen for guidance when the Emberlight flickered uncertainly. Not far from Bramblehollow lay the valley of Mistvale, a place shrouded in perpetual morning fog. Tales told of a lantern lost there, a lantern so bright it could cut through any darkness, but which had vanished generations ago, swallowed by mist and silence. One autumn, a young girl named Ira ventured into Mistvale, driven by a longing she could not explain. With only a small candle and her steady heart, she walked into the swirling gray. Days passed. The village held its breath. Then, on a morning like no other, Ira returned, clutching a lantern wrapped in emerald vines that shimmered with dew. The light inside pulsed like a heartbeat. She told the villagers that the lantern had called to her, guiding her through the fog on a path only the brave could follow. With the lost lantern returned, a new glow spread through Bramblehollow, stronger and more vibrant than before. The keepers knew then that light was never truly lost. It only waited to be found again. Once every year, when the harvest moon hung low and golden over the village, Bramblehollow held the Feast of Lights, a celebration where every lantern was lit in unison, sending ripples of glow across the night sky. Villagers prepared for days, crafting lanterns from paper, glass, and leaves, each one carrying wishes, stories, and memories. The feast was a time for laughter, for sharing songs and tales, for remembering those who had passed and welcoming new beginnings. Children danced in circles, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies, while elders sat beneath the willow, telling stories of keepers past. As the final lantern was lit, Linwin would stand by the Emberlight, her voice rising in a song passed down through generations, a song that wrapped around the village like a warm blanket. And in those moments, the light seemed to sing back, a chorus of hope and belonging that no darkness could ever silence. The seasons turned, and the story of Bramblehollow continued to weave itself through time like threads of gold and silver. The lanterns burned steady, the village glowing softly beneath stars that watched like guardians. And though each keeper would one day pass the flame to another, the promise remained unchanged, that no matter how dark the night, the light would always return. As dawn touched the horizon, the Emberlight and all its kindred glimmers stretched and yawned, ready to greet a new day filled with quiet wonders, whispered dreams, and the endless magic of a light shared by many hearts. Years had passed since Linwin first became keeper of the Emberlight. The village had flourished, the glow of its lanterns reaching far beyond the hills, touching hearts and kindling hope. But time, as it always does, whispered change. Linwin felt the weight of the lantern growing lighter in her hands, and she knew it was time to choose the next keeper, someone with a heart brave enough to carry the light forward. She chose Fen, the quiet boy whose sketches had once helped them find the lost song of the lanterns. Now a young man, his eyes still held the wonder and patience that the village needed. One crisp morning, beneath the branches of the whispering willow, Linwin passed the Emberlight to Fen. "May your heart sing with the light," she said softly. Fen held the lantern close, feeling its steady pulse. "I promise to carry it well." That night, the village gathered once more under a sky bursting with stars. Lanterns floated gently upward, each a little beacon of dreams and memories. Ira's lantern from Mistvale gleamed with a soft green hue, the whispering willow shimmered in the breeze, and the Emberlight in Fen's hands glowed steady and bright. The keepers and villagers stood in silence, listening to the song of the lanterns, a melody woven from every hope, every story, and every heartbeat. And in that shared moment, the light felt endless. As dawn brushed the sky with soft pinks and golds, the lantern's glow faded into the morning mist, resting until night would call them again. Bramblehollow awoke, peaceful and glowing with quiet magic. Fen looked out over the village and whispered, "The light will always live, as long as we remember to carry it." And so, the story of Bramblehollow's lanterns and their keepers became a gentle promise, passed down through time, a beacon for every heart seeking warmth in the dark.